Hey everyone, welcome to the 14th installation of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation webinar series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the founder of Project Medtech and the Project Medtech podcast. For those of you who don't know, Project Medtech is a networking company that's focused on the medtech industry with our goal to strengthen connections within the industry to improve the speed of delivery and success of innovative technologies to patients. For more information, you can follow us on LinkedIn, check out our website, www.projectmedtech.com, and follow our podcast series called Project Medtech. It can be found on any major podcasting platform, including Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Google Podcast. Today, we'll be discussing a critical piece of the medical device development or medical device product development process, including preclinical, regulatory, and clinical trials. We have a fantastic panel of experts here who I'll introduce in just a moment, but first, a quick introduction to Galen Data for those who are not familiar. Galen Data is the cloud for medical device makers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device to cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. Built on 40 plus years of collective experience developing compliance systems in the medical device industry, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Okay, very good. So we have three individuals today who we asked to come together to cover three different areas of product development. So we're going to start and go around the horn and introduce ourselves. We'll start with Jack and move to Isabella and Jason.
Sure, yep, Jack Risdahl. I'm a veterinarian by training. I'm currently a product development strategist on our consulting side of the business with NAMSA. And NAMSA is a global contract research organization we really do a lot of work across the board through the whole product development cycle. And I've been doing this for about 30 years, and my expertise is in the preclinical realm and developing animal studies and getting through the regulated process. Both with FDA as well as Europe and other places in the world.
All right. I'm Isabella Schmitt. I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs at Proxima Clinical Research. My background is in quality, regulatory, and clinical in both biopharma and medical devices. At Proxima, we work with emerging companies or big companies that act like emerging companies with regulatory, quality, and clinical. So we do regulatory and quality consulting, set up QMS, submissions, and then we do full clinical trial execution as well. And I lead the regulatory team.
And hi all, I'm Jason Krzeszak. I also work at NAMSA with Jack. I lead the product development strategy team. That's a group of about 15 consultants that help across the product development plan for startups and large companies that also have products that need some strategy support. My background is in leading clinical research. I've led the clinical function at large companies like Medtronic, and also have helped small startups by working for them in the past. So definitely have a lot of experience that could help you, and I look forward to the questions today.
Awesome, thanks so much. So we're going to start with a few questions for each of you, right? And then we'll kind of merge some of these conversations as we go. And so I want to start with one that for Isabella that I see often, and is the easiest regulatory path always the best?
Okay. No, is the short answer. And I would say, we always joke as consultants that we always say it depends about everything, but it really does depend about everything. So the easiest regulatory path isn't always the best regulatory path, because ultimately and when we say regulatory path, we're thinking probably along the lines of submission type, right? So 510K, PMA, de novo. Ultimately, to get clearance or approval with FDA, you have to generate the evidence that's necessary to show that the device is safe and effective. And regardless of whether you're 510K, a de novo, or a PMA, that evidence needs to be generated. So if you have a product that is, maybe borderline 510 or borderline de novo PMA, right? So it's a new product, you don't have a predicate, so you're not going to go 510K. The burden to do a PMA, there are a couple of additional things that you'll have to do to get a PMA out the side of what you'd have to do for a de novo, one of which is like a pre-approval inspection, but hopefully you already have a QMS set up, so that shouldn't really be a problem for you. But the other thing, you have some post-market requirements, things like that FDA may give you. But ultimately with PMAs, you have what's called data integrity that you don't get with de novos or 510Ks. And so essentially if you have a PMA, no one can use you as a predicate to do a 510K or to do a PMA really. So you have to really generate the data yourself. And so if you're going to have to generate that data anyway, it may behoove you to do the PMA route. From outside of regulatory, from an exit and acquisition standpoint, PMAs typically exit faster with higher exits than de novos and 510Ks do. So that's another consideration. So when you're thinking about these things, you also want to consider, okay, what's my exit strategy and what's my market, right? So if you have a product that has a small market and it's maybe either smaller or a diluted market, right? You probably don't want to spend a whole lot of time and money developing a PMA product. But if you have a market that isn't diluted and your product's going into that market, or a really, really large market, a 510K might be the route to take. And so you have to consider business, exit strategy, product development, what the testing is going to look like and all of that, not just like, oh, a PMA is a class 3, that's the hardest one, a 510K is class 2, easiest one, or 510K exemption, I guess, is technically the easiest. You don't have to file a submission then, but sure. I would, you want to consider a holistic picture. You want to consider things like reimbursement and things like that as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's great advice. That question stems from an example I just had recently where I was talking to a client who wanted to go after a PMA and said, well, we might do something in the wound care space. And because it was a 510K, they can get to market sooner and they, well, we'll sell this. And I just kind of brought up the point of, in principle, it sounds good, but are you sure you're going to sell any of your product? That's a very diluted market. I mean, there's a lot of products in that space. Are you going to capture some of that? So it's something always worth discussing, and I know it's general. In past, a lot of people want to go this 510K route because they think it's the best or it's the quickest, right? Maybe not the best. So no, I appreciate that answer. Kind of going so with the regulatory path, going over to Jack here with preclinical. So preclinical. This efficacy testing where you're proving your model, it's something that it's at the very beginning, but there's key steps to saving time, money, overlap, all of this, right? So you have a general idea of your regulatory path. How in this beginning step, like what is your best advice for planning for understanding that you need to require, you're going to have to hit some regulatory marks for the FDA. You can possibly address some biocompatibility endpoints, which can save you money later. But you're also probably using some of the results of this to capture more funding, right? Maybe your seed round or even your Series A. So how do you take into account all those things and plan an effective preclinical model?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dwayne, and we see it a lot. There's always all these competing forces when you're first starting out and you have all these things to do, and I think the key is really sorting out. Think about having the end in mind, and then doing it in the most simple, cleanest way possible, and avoid the mistakes. And we see, a number of clients trying to do too much too quickly, or they sort of get off track and they sort of linger in an academic pursuit, trying to show, that their product does all these great things, and so they waste time and money. And you when you have the competing forces between trying to demonstrate your product's efficacy for your investors versus trying to show that your product is safe and effective for a regulatory path, you kind of have to decide whether or not sometimes you can build them in one study, and sometimes you should tease them apart, because your regulatory study you want as clean as possible. You want that to be straightforward and easy. And the best thing to do is get in front of the FDA early, communicate early with notified bodies, and then really plan for understanding what it is that you have to do for your regulated studies. And so that really helps you focus on what you need to do. And then for your investors, then stepping back and deciding, is what I need to show that money shot, we always call it, is that going to confound my study? Should I do that on the side, or can I actually incorporate that into my regulated study? And each case is situational. Sometimes you can grab that data and you get these great pictures in your regulated studies. Sometimes it's better to set that, to do that elsewhere and keep your other study, your regulated study, nice and focused and clean. So I think ultimately it's good planning that needs to occur.
Okay. No, that's super helpful. Before I bounce over to Jason real quick, you mentioned it, pre-submission meetings.
Yep.
Isabella, this is something that comes up quite frequently. Pre-submission meetings, do you recommend them every time? Do you not? My recommendation is, if you're going to go to a pre-submission meeting, please go with someone who's been to one before and knows the strategy. Can you maybe just share the importance of that and why, if you don't, it could be a problem?
Yeah, okay. So there was a lot there to unpack. So first thing is with pre-submissions, usually I recommend going to a pre-submission. There are specific cases where it may not make sense. If you're very clearly a 510K, the testing strategy is very obvious, and you don't really think there are going to be many gotchas, and anything that you think may come up will be addressable within that 180-day hold, and maybe sooner than that 180 days if you get a request for information, which you basically always get a request for information. And that's specific to 510K, right? Obviously, if you have a PMA de novo, if you don't go to a pre-sub, that is egregious. But so pre-subs, going with a person who's done them before. A lot of companies will go to FDA by themselves and think, oh, well, because we know the product and we can write about it, obviously everything we say is going to be well recepted by FDA, well received. And that's not the case. There are specific things that, having done this before, as a person who's engaged with FDA, it's kind of like getting into their mind, right? So sort of like playing Inception with them, where you're, okay, I know how an FDA reviewer thinks. I know the types of things they want to see. I know what they're going to be looking for. And when you're talking about your own product, sometimes it's hard to see the things that are obvious to you, but not obvious to other people. And so they often make mistakes doing that. And a lot of companies think, that their product is so great and so wonderful, and maybe it is great and wonderful, but FDA, they're skeptical, right? And that's their job, is to be skeptics, to make sure that what you're going to give to the world is safe and effective. Even if it's wonderful, it still has to be safe and effective, right? And so they're not going to be like, hey, this product's great and wonderful, so you get all these free passes. They're still going to ask you for the same things that they normally ask you for. Now, they're really invested in, hey, this product is great and wonderful, and this is dependent on the division and the culture within that group, right? But sometimes they'll work with you a little bit more interactively than other divisions will. But for the most part, things are by the book, and you, having done a lot of interactions with FDA, having pulled together a lot of submissions, what they look like, generally kind of how FDA thinks. And if you've never done it before, obviously you're not going to know those things. It is a specific nuance and niche to it. And then the different types of submissions have different requirements too. So pre-sub has a certain set of things you want to make sure are in there. A breakthrough device designation kind of takes a look and feel different to other documents. And then the market submissions obviously have specific content requirements and all of that. So make sure you get appropriate expertise.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I'd love to chime in if I can, and it might be a good segue. You know, for me, especially working with the agency with pre-subs, there's two goals. There may be more, but de-risking your product development plan and also building a relationship with FDA. It's going to be kind of there, you know, working with you throughout the whole process. So certainly de-risking and relationship building takes a little time, and it takes some lead time. So, you know, I know startups are often stretched, focusing on many different things at once, but having someone in the company kind of thinking through that lead time, I think is ultimately going to prove valuable, no matter what the specific questions you may be asking at the pre-sub.
You can have more than one.
And just I want to add to that too, is I think, you know, having, you know, people, you know, like myself, like Jason, like Isabella, who have been to FDA, I think what Isabella said about understanding what FDA says is great, because again, for free, FDA tells you what they want in those pre-sub meetings. And we're sort of the interpreters too, because there's an FDA speak, if you will, in terms of how they say things, and interpreting that and understanding, what is, when they say you should, we think you must, and how is the key in terms of how you interpret those things. So it's a really worthy effort for companies. Of course, like Isabella mentioned, unless it's obvious, but there's few of those. I think in most cases, it's usually good to get in front of FDA early and often, and that'll really help ratify that path.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would also maybe add that one thing that companies may do as well, is go at the wrong time for what they want to talk to FDA about, right? Or they approach FDA about the wrong thing for where they are. And so you can have a pre-sub, to really just say, hey, this is what I'm thinking about my regulatory strategy, but is that maybe the best use of a pre-sub? Maybe you want to go to an informational meeting, which is another type of Q-sub. And so if you approach them, early is great, but there is a too early depending on what you want to talk to them about. So if you're not ready to talk to them about your animal study or your clinical protocol or even your regulatory strategy, like you don't really have your intended use nailed down, you probably don't want to get in front of them, because then you get in front of them too early, you get them thinking about one thing, or you share information about something that you're not really ready to share information about, and then they remember that, and then if you kind of go back and forth to the relationship building point, it gets frustrating to them and it erodes their trust in what you're doing overall, and you don't want to do that. So you want to trust the people that you work with, who work with FDA a whole lot, to tell you like, hey, you're maybe too early for this. Maybe we should do this instead. Or maybe we just wait until you make that decision or get that data or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. No, it's great advice. I mean, I really wanted to make sure that question was out there, because I've seen a number of horror stories, right, where someone went too early and didn't ask the right questions or didn't present the right information. And the worst one I have ever seen was someone was on the border of a device and a drug, and they got classified as a drug, and they should have been a device, and that's going to be a time killer, right? So anyways, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but it's apparent why you need someone with experience. So Jason, kind of kicking it over to you here. It's very easy for startup companies or someone who's early in a product development to understand why they might need Jack involved and Isabella involved, but the clinical side of things, right? A lot of times, people get tunnel vision, it's out of sight, out of mind, or I'm not even close to that yet. I obviously am a proponent for involving clinical early, right? But I'd like to hear that from you on why that's necessary. And also if you could weave in the pillars that you think of when you're thinking of your clinical plan, what are those pillars, those main drivers that are going to, help you design those trials and your clinical plan?
Yeah, great question, Dwayne. Having firsthand experience in a startup environment as a clinical affairs leader, reporting to the CEO, a very small company. I was brought in about 3 months ahead of when they planned to start clinical, and I always felt like that was really unfortunate because the clinical function can be undervalued in the development process. I feel like there's a lot of focus in engineering, technical aspects of devices up front, but they may have 1 or 2 advocates within the medical community so their inputs are kind of maybe biased to certain individuals that may even have a stake in the company. And so really bringing in someone that has a clinical experience early, I think adds significant value. And a few things I can think of right off the bat is helping with the design inputs, evaluating some risks, having someone that has some focus on quality management systems, because we know engineers may not work in that type of regulated environment. And so, they will in the medical device space, but it's not always relevant on how important that quality system will hold them up down the road if they don't do things from the appropriate way from the beginning. So clinical people tend to have this mindset because they've seen that down at the end when they're in the clinical study, hearing about issues that would have been kind of managed better up front. Often as well, there's the clinical study plan, like the actual study protocol, but there's also the approach. Like, do you want to be aggressive and go a straight to pivotal approach with your clinical study? Or do you want to take a more conservative approach and allow design iterations by going through a feasibility approach and then a pivotal approach? Like that kind of thought process takes way more than 3 months before you're ready for clinical to get ready, because then you're going to have investors and people, stakeholders at the company that are looking for you to get started. So a lot of those decisions are almost made by default. I also find clinical tends to give a lot of focus on details like standard operating procedures, instructions for use development, and also forecasting realistic clinical study budgets and timelines. And so, if you're a startup and you're looking to, you're on stretched resources already and not so sure when to bring in that clinical functional leader, I would say obtain some consulting early on with someone that is going to provide an external perspective and help you along the way. And look for someone that could help broaden the value within your organization outside of just what you might expect as a clinical study leader. So that can kind of help you in many different ways than just clinical study planning.
Yeah.
You had a second question. Do you want me to address that or just?
Yeah, definitely. Do you remember it? I forget. I'm sorry.
I do, because it was a little bit like your first question. You asked about the least, like more or less, is the least burdensome regulatory path always the best?
Yep.
And of course, as Isabella said, it always depends. But in clinical evidence planning, I think of it as burden versus value. So you could have a least burdensome clinical study that sets your device against a comparator that is, has let's say a low effectiveness rate, and it's a bit outdated standard of care. That might resonate with regulators to say, okay, well, that looks appropriate, you can move that forward. But if you get to the end of that study and that benchmark is not within what the market would expect, they might just say, well, who cares? That's really great, but that data doesn't really resonate with me. I have another option that works way better than that. So where's your evidence that you can meet that standard? So you got to have someone, especially a clinical person, again, like I said, can think through options strategically about, should we take a little more risk up front and test to a higher bar? It may mean a longer, maybe regulatory timeline or path to market. But at the end, with the end in mind, you get a lot more value out of that time spent. So I think that's what I think that was the question.
Can I hop in and add some stuff to what you said?
Absolutely.
I wrote a few points. Okay, so starting with the quality stuff that you mentioned first. So with risk management specifically, and I think this is like alluding to the point that you were making too, a lot of the times you'll have engineers involved in risk management and they're like, oh, I got my engineers and that's all I need. And they'll do like a DFMEA or something. And they don't take a clinician or someone with that clinical perspective into those risk management discussions. And so you're missing, like you were saying, design inputs, mitigations that were necessary, that maybe you need to test through clinical, maybe you need to test through preclinical, and that if you don't look at that till like, oh, we're ready to do our pivotal, you're like, probably not. You're gonna have to go back. You're eating away valuable time. And then, you know, the question about, do you go straight into pivotal? And that kind of reminded me too, like sometimes companies will want to do a pilot study or a feasibility study, and they'll want to put like specific endpoints or like criteria, acceptance criteria at this really early stage. And that seems good in some ways, but in other ways, if you give yourself like these acceptance criteria before you're ready for them, you can fail that study, right? And then that can really impact you with investors and make it almost untenable for you to bring the product forward. So you probably want to do a feasibility study, a pilot study, especially if you're like a PMA product and you have to have a large safety database and all of this. But from the perspective of how you design those studies, I think you need to think critically about like not just giving yourself a really high bar early on, like, and meaning like with a feasibility study, because you could really put yourself, you know, in a difficult position. And then the third thing, I forgot, I wrote timeline, but I don't remember what it was now, so we can move on.
No, I thought that was,
I think in summary though, Dwayne, it's valuable, and you can just see from this discussion, having experienced people with multiple cross-functional backgrounds at the table to talk through strategy early brings all those perspectives to the forefront. So there's always been a lot of value, I think.
Yeah. And I was just going to kind of say this, right? So if we were to add a fifth person to this, it would be reimbursement. And that person spoke at the last Galen Data webinar series, right? So we had a whole hour on reimbursement. But I think when you think of those folks in there in the room, you guys can see how this is valuable, of how an adjustment in regulatory might affect the reimbursement, which is going to affect preclinical. And that clinical person, while they're not involved right now, they have to be in there from a budgeting perspective, a planning perspective, because, you know, we've all seen clinical trials. I mean, they're expensive, they're costly, they're time consuming. So one change in a clinical budget could increase at $500,000, right? I mean, no problem. So you know, I think it's wise for startups to have that expertise in there. It's probably not necessary for them to be a full-time employee or anything like that, but going out and getting some consulting hours is probably wise.
And say, Dwayne, and what you're talking about too is a good comprehensive product development plan, and
Yes.
your investors will probably want to see that too, because that's really, you know, right on the front end. That great comprehensive plan really shows, you know, what your exit strategy is and what the cost is going to be all along the way.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the earlier you can get that laid out, the better.
You're 100% right, and I think that it doesn't need to. You don't have to. I think sometimes people freak out. It's like, oh, we have a plan. That means we're settling on that, and that's not true. You can always pivot, but at least having that plan and then knowing when you make a change, bringing in this group of people again, right, and kind of talking about, okay, if I make this change, how does that affect our regulatory? How does that affect our clinical? So you guys are totally right. So one thing I want to ask.
I would say, to your point, sorry, Dwayne, you probably want to keep that a living document, the product development plan, regulatory strategy, and all of that, because there are going to be things that should feed into it. So you shouldn't think of it like, oh, I did that, box checked, and then move on and never look at it again.
Yeah,
it's very rare that it's going to stay the same if you do it early on at the right place where you're supposed to start doing it, kind of planning, not like right before your submission. You know, it's probably going to evolve, and it should. I mean, I can't think of a time that it wouldn't really.
Yeah. Yep. So Jack, another question to you. I know there's a lot of standard models, and a lot of times people will pick products that have already been on the market or something similar, and they'll take that model and modify it, that sort of thing. What do you do when, you know, what you need to prove is so unique? I mean, is this one of those scenarios where you want to make sure you're at the FDA, kind of going through with them, and when you're at the FDA, is it saying, hey, what do you want me to do? Or is it, hey, this is what we plan to do and this is why we plan to do it? Can you kind of walk through that a little bit?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and we run into it occasionally where, you get some of these de novo devices and/or products, and again, we're starting to, mix therapies, drug devices and biologic devices, and kind of 3D printing type devices and things that people haven't seen before or tested before, and so we have to develop the preclinical path. It's a great opportunity to walk into FDA with a plan and have them throw rocks at your plan, because especially with those types of very unique products, you really want their buy-in. And I think you never really want to ask the agency whether or not what should I do. Rather, you're better bringing in your plan and then having them give you feedback, and they'll tell you if they do or don't agree with you, and they'll also give you their opinions in terms of what they think you should do. And sometimes with some of the very unique things, there may not be an animal model. It may be that we have to tease things apart and test endpoints for a variety of different things, materials testing versus clinical function. And in some cases, you can't even get it into an animal model. And there's lots of tricks that we use. Sometimes we have to manufacture animal-specific devices. We run into that sometimes in the biologics world when you're doing cell therapies and things like that because of rejections and whatnot. You actually have to utilize species-specific types of tissue products and that sort of thing. Sometimes there's component testing that needs to occur. Sometimes we have to utilize human cadaveric specimens for dip in performance type of an aspect. Mm-hmm. And some of this may actually, drive it towards Jason's world, which is the clinical trial, because the animal model may have some limitations, and you may need to do some early safety testing in your human clinical trials because your animal models don't fully answer it. But FDA and notified bodies, they're going to expect that you have given them a convincing data set around the safety and some sort of feasibility of efficacy. But each product is unique, and a lot of times we just have to work through that process with our sponsors to actually identify what the right path is. But it's an interactive approach, and usually when you bring in our team or other consultants who've had experience with this, we can kind of take from our experience and make a best guess in terms of some of these unique products as to what the path might be. And then getting that agency interaction early on is always a great thing.
Okay, awesome.
I've seen this firsthand too, Jack, and all your points resonate with me. It's as if we're on the same team or something. I've seen in these early products, the animal study is an important milestone. And I've seen a lot of effort getting through it, but then not a lot of debrief. I mean, it's a really good time to debrief in that feasibility pilot animal study about, are you staying true to your design requirements? Do you have an IFU started? Is it, what can you learn through that process? Because as a clinical person, I'm usually looking to de-risk that in the clinical study. So the animal model limitations are sometimes evident, but that's always eye-opening to me to say, well, we didn't really get a true sense to test this particular aspects of the device. So I'm going to pay attention to its, potential issues in the human setting. But just words of encouragement to kind of make a true debrief out of that, not just get on to the next thing, but see what you can learn from us.
So you are looking at animal testing in the clinical area.
Oh, yeah, I think it goes both ways. I think it's in the preclinical realm. We need to be thinking about that clinical trial. They're sort of hand in hand in that total evidence chain, for approval and final approval. And so sometimes, we can even vet out some of the clinical endpoints in the animal studies that will actually inform the clinical trials in terms of how to evaluate some of those things in the patient. And again, having those clinicians involved in terms of the clinical relevancy is always a great thing early on, and something we try to build in and FDA, it resonates with them as well.
So Isabella,
yeah, and I think it becomes really important with like de novo products, kind of like you were saying, both from a design and a clinical study perspective, and understanding how this new type of product may work in an animal model, which animal model is the best, but also a lot of de novos require clinical trials, but there are some that don't, and it's usually because the animal model is sufficient to test the intended use. And so understanding your intended use and understanding how clinically relevant your animal model is can sort of de-risk your entire strategy for approval, because you may not ultimately end up needing a clinical trial, but you'll need to really explain to FDA how that animal model is relevant clinically to test your intended use. And so I think that's a really important thing to vet and understand.
I appreciate that. I was not aware that an animal study could negate clinical for de novo, but while we're there on the de novo subject, so, and I don't know, I haven't vetted this, so I'm going to vet this with you now. I'd like to get your opinion on this. I've heard some CEOs of startup companies talk about the de novo pathway and say it's useless because we don't want to be the first to market, because we're just going to pave the way for the next company that wants to have a 510K. Is that valid? Is that accurate? Can you just unpack that? I don't fully understand it, so I'm asking.
I think useless is a really strong word.
Okay.
I mean, ultimately, you don't have a choice if you end up being de novo. I mean, it is, so then you just say my product is dead. But I think the de novo pathway does have some value in that ultimately you're basically saying that there isn't already a product out there like yours. So either you're treating a different indication or a different patient population such that you're required to be de novo, or you're technologically different, which hopefully if you're technologically different, it's an improvement to what is already out there. And again, we're going back to the market, right? Like, can I convince the market that this improvement is good enough? And so, you know, for those reasons, de novos can be pretty valuable. And then the other thing is sometimes de novos have better exit strategies than 510Ks too, right? So with PMAs typically being the best exit strategy, well, I guess it depends on what you want to do ultimately, right? Like if you want to keep the product, not exit, develop a sales team and all of that and sell it, then, you know, 510K may be better. But if you want to exit early with a pretty high exit, you're probably looking at a PMA, and then the de novo would be kind of the second tier for that. And I mean, what they're saying is true, though. You know, you're the first to market. You go to FDA, and then someone can 510K to your product. But you also get to propose the special controls that are required for the product. So if you put a clinical study in there, they have to do a clinical study.
Yes.
And, you know, talking with some FDA reviewers and ex-FDA consultants and, you know, being in this space, that can be good and bad. I mean, it's usually good for the first company, right? But it can be bad because it can really make it overly burdensome to have new technologies come out and be able to 510K to that original. And so you really want to be considerate about what you put in there. You know, obviously, the harder you make it, the better it is for you in the long term. But it could also make it difficult for you to 510K to your own product then, right?
Okay.
And so those are the types of things you want to consider. So you do have some control over what the requirements are, and being the first gives you that control. You know, 510K to a de novo after, you don't really have that control, or doing a 510K to a 510K, you don't have that control.
Okay, and
Wayne,
I
add to that. So, you know, if the customer's thinking the client is thinking that they are de novo is useless, then they must be thinking that their other route is a PMA if they want to protect themselves from a you know, being able to be copied perspective. Because I have heard some good words of advice. If you know, if you're going to be a 510K, you know, traditional, you ought to be cheaper. So, you know, if you do have a significant cost advantage, then certainly de novo would be maybe useless, you know, in quotes. But Certainly PMA has different post-marketing requirements and other types of expenses and concerns. So, but really, you know, Isabella, for example, like, or any regulatory consultant could probably help people think that through early on and provide the pros and cons, you know, so they can.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
And, you know, sometimes, you know, having to throw in that preclinical side with 510Ks, because a lot of times with the 510K, the animal studies are all you really need. We sometimes really have difficulties with predicates and then showing kind of the non-inferiority to the performance and safety testing of some of the predicates. And that's when you're doing these de novos, it is, you know, sometimes the challenge and how we get pushed towards these de novo pathways. And maybe it may still be simple, and each product is so different, and you have to kind of look at each one, and sometimes it makes more sense to go the PMA route, and sometimes it makes more sense to do the de novo, and it really depends a lot on what it is and what endpoints you have to hit and achieve for that performance and safety testing.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it goes back to like, what are your evidence requirements again, right? So kind of like what I was saying at the beginning, if you have a 510K that requires clinicals, which some of them do, either because like the standard that they're testing to says you need clinicals, or there's a difference between the predicate and your device that requires a clinical, that between that and de novo, like, it's, you know, not really that much. You know, the cost to the submission is a little bit higher for de novo if you're a small business. If you're not a small business, it can be quite a bit more. But, you know, I think what we were saying was ultimately, I think the data integrity and all of that afforded with the PMA has those specific advantages. And so if you're going to have to do a whole bunch of clinical trials and you probably don't want to be de novo, probably would rather be PMA. But you don't necessarily get to make that decision. And you really don't definitively know, like 100%, until you submit your final pre-market submission. So if you submit a de novo and they're like, man, you're PMA, then you're PMA, right? I mean, they typically try to stick with what they say to you, but I've seen it where, you know, companies have been told, hey, you're a 510K multiple times, and then suddenly, nah, we changed our mind, you're a de novo. So, you know, you 100% know once you've submitted, but until then, you're kind of making an educated guess.
Yeah, no, it's helpful. So we have some questions coming in here. One I can tackle. It was just to kind of clarify, when we say exit strategy, we are talking about exiting the business by sale, merger, you stepping down as the CEO, whatever it might be, right? I mean, generally the exit strategy is to sell or merge or to commercialize. But yeah, that is what we're referring to. Another question we got, and this one I'd like to keep fairly short, and this can go to all three of you because you're all involved in this process. In-person pre-sub versus a call. Obviously for 2020 and whatnot, we didn't have that option, but do you prefer one or the other? I'm guessing it depends on what you're trying to discuss, or kind of go around the horn here. Isabella, Jason, Jack.
Okay. So again, it depends. I think, you know, obviously in person is always better than a teleconference, right? Like if money were no issue, right? But considering you're a startup and, you know, cash is king to you and you're probably trying to be budget conscious, if you're going to talk about, if you're really early stage and you really don't even have your prototype fully developed, so you don't have something to show them, and you're going to talk about early regulatory strategy or something like that, probably wouldn't go in person if you're worried about cost. If you're going to talk about your pivotal study and you have the option to go in person, I would 100% recommend going in person. You know, right now, as you alluded to, that's not an option, but the teleconferences have been going really well. FDA doesn't usually turn on their cameras, so it's really a teleconference still. It's not a video conference, but you know, you can get really useful feedback from the teleconferences, even about pivotal studies. But obviously, you know, going in person affords the ability to read body language. You seem more like a person and less like a voice, and all of the things that in-person meetings give you the ability to show your technology, have them touch it, whatever, if that's possible. You know, if you have an MRI machine, probably not going to wheel that in, but you know, that's why people recommend in person. But I wouldn't say, oh, I'm going to wait indefinitely now because we don't know when we're going to have in-person meetings again, just so that I can go in person. You should talk to them through a teleconference. It's still pretty useful.
Okay. Jason, Jack, you agree with that? I mean, I don't know if there's anything more to add.
I think in my mind, in-person is great when it's complicated because you can read the body language and you can deal with those heavy issues. But I have to say, FDA's in the last couple of years with COVID, they seem to be managing those teleconferences really well. And I think they're getting quite comfortable with them as well. So, you know, it probably most of the time works fine with the teleconference. And then in those really more difficult conversations, you know, the in-person is probably better.
Okay. So another one of the questions, and I'll throw this to Jason. And I think this is probably just because, you know, some startups just haven't worked with CROs before. But when talking about clinical, you know, how early should one engage a CRO to begin these discussions?
Yeah, it's a partnership. You know, CROs will work with manufacturers for a long term, and so, you know, it's just like any other relationship, like starting to consider your options early, getting a good assessment on what pros and cons each potential partner would have is very important. And once you make so that selection process can take 6 months. You know, if you're in a pinch, which most are, it might take only 1 month, or I was kind of selecting someone. But then you're kind of going in on it a little more blind. And you know, when you have a CRO selected, I would say have someone in your organization singularly responsible for that relationship and have attention to having set clear expectations with the people on the other end at the CRO, because the CRO has your best interests in mind and wants to prioritize your product and clinical study. However, you know, often things will occur on other types of studies that maybe supporting that needs a sudden pull for resources, you know. So, having someone kind of responsible for setting those expectations and then periodically reminding and kind of evaluating on both ends how things are going, I think is very important to keep that relationship strong.
Yeah. And something to add to this is, so for those who don't know my background, which I don't think anyone would know, I used to work for NAMSA. I currently work for Covance, which is now LabCorp. I know Proxima really well. You hear other CROs out there like Syneos and Icon and I think Avanya, some of these other big CROs. All the CROs probably have people like Isabella, Jason, and Jack, who will work with you as a consultant, and they could also execute on animal studies or the clinical trials. So those are also good trial periods for you to, you know, get to know that organization, build a relationship. And I can tell you that the stronger relationship you build there, the better that clinical trial is probably going to go, right? So if Isabella has been working with you from the very beginning, planning everything you're going to do, she's going to have a very clear picture of why you are where you are, right? So sometimes just keep that in mind. If you're planning this clinical trial and then you just decide you're going to go talk to someone, they don't understand your story so far. And you can give them the story, but if they live it, it's a lot easier. So just keep that in mind.
And I just want to add, Dwayne, you know, especially in a startup, you're gonna have to realize, like, you will have to partner with someone as a CRO because you won't have those internal capabilities. Sometimes I've heard companies would rather take it in-house and do that work from scratch, which is, you know, that's a real hard task on top of developing the product. So yeah, lots to be learned in choosing CRO and working with them. And,
Yeah, and I want to add on the timeline front for selecting CROs and engaging with them. I think lots of companies underestimate the sort of startup timeline that there is, the contracting, the IRB, the site selection, all of that. They think like, oh, I'm ready to start and now I can just start. But that is its own sort of startup timeline, which you have to work with the sites to get done. And also sites have their own costs as well outside of the CRO costs. So they should be, mindful of those things as well. And also, another thing that I've found companies who are not familiar with clinical trials and how they work, the sites are working for you, right, on your study. So, sometimes they'll be nervous to upset the sites by asking them to do what the protocol says they need to do, and things like that. And it's like, the site's working for you. They have to follow the protocol. They have to mark those, deviations or fix the case report forms or whatever it might be. And so be mindful that obviously you don't want to berate the sites and you want to maintain a good site relationship, but they are working for you. They're not doing you a favor. You're paying them. So be aware of that.
Awesome. So we're getting a lot of good questions coming in. So I'm going to try to make these as we do have a hard stop, so I'll make it as clear as possible. Someone asked about the podcast we had mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. It's called Project Medtech, so you can find that anywhere. There was a discussion, and I'm just going to go ahead and answer this for you guys, and unless you adamantly disagree, it was about reimbursement and consulting a reimbursement before a pre-sub. Personally, it's just from a business perspective, you 100% should do that. If you do not have reimbursement, and I'm not just talking about CPT codes, but there's more to reimbursement than just that, you have a very expensive hobby. And that might be an exaggeration to a certain extent, but you have to understand that, right? I mean, if you don't, it's not going to work out well. So I think consulting reimbursement while you're discussing with the regulatory consultant, super valuable, and I'm sure the regulatory consultants would appreciate that as well. I did get a question about the competitive environment, right? So if I have a new product that is going to compete with yours, I don't see why it is any different for me to go 510K against you, no matter whether you got to market via de novo or a PMA. What are they missing? And I think that Isabella kind of described that with de novo, you're setting the bar, correct? I mean, is that how you would address that, Isabella?
Yes, and with PMA, no one can use you as a predicate. So if you have two, let's say LVADs, my favorite example of a PMA, you have two LVADs, one LVAD can't do a 510K to the PMA LVAD, right? They're both PMAs, you both have to do trials, all of that. So the bar is already set. The burden is a bit higher for PMAs. You have to have clinicals. And yeah, you already covered de novo.
Okay. And then something I wanted to bring up real quick. I know we're close to time, and this might be a can of worms, so as brief as possible. We've seen the EU going towards, they have rolled out a UMDR, which is asking for clinical evidence, right? The FDA is not there yet. However, some would speculate in some fashion, it's possible we can move that way here in the States, right? I think a lot of this drove around a documentary that was aired years ago on Netflix. I think it's called The Bleeding Edge. But regardless, a lot of products that are approved do not have clinical evidence or very poor clinical evidence because they were, they addressed it through being a 510K. I'm curious how, not saying that's actually happening, we're going towards that, but how do companies prepare for that post-market in terms of collecting clinical data and having a robust system to do that? I'll start with Jason and Isabella if you want to add on.
Yeah, no, I've seen this done well. There are some smart companies out there that are thinking this way, thinking about post-market as they're developing the product. And one key is relationships with those users, those physicians. They'll be your strongest advocate during a clinical trial, and they'll also be an advocate for continuing clinical research in the post-market realm. So I think that's one opportunity. I think there is always I'm a little biased, but I always do like to see products that have clinical benefits shown in the clinical stage, not just the safety and effectiveness measures that were part of the protocol. So, I think that's kind of MDR has some roots in showing clinical benefits, and that always can't be obtained through literature. So there is always a need, I think, to invest in some sound pre-market or post-market clinical data.
But I think it pays off from the marketing standpoint of a company as well, because they can turn around and use that clinical evidence for their claims, and it helps them in their marketing process. So it's a savvy approach, really, just from a business standpoint.
Yeah, I think also if you're following what you need to for post-market, like complaint collection and reporting, BOD reporting, product feedback, so that product feedback can not always necessarily be negative, and not all negative feedback is a complaint. So really having a robust system around product feedback and complaints, you'll have a good understanding of what's happening in the market. You can run analyses on that, establish KPIs around it. All of that is, obviously going to feed into that as well.
Awesome. One question that came in, and 4 minutes left. Very out of the box thinking, can I convert my traditional feasibility into a pivotal halfway through so I can continue to use the IRB approvals?
I mean, I'm likely thinking likely no, but there could be some creative options to entertain that idea. That's, yeah. I like to be creative, and it's also often worth asking the question and getting some help, and then assessing whether that's an appropriate route or not.
Yeah,
I think it would probably depend on when you're trying to do that and make that decision. Like if you're about to close out the feasibility study and you really need to get started with the pivotal, maybe not. You probably want to approach that subject with FDA beforehand to make sure that that's acceptable to them before you try that.
Yep. Okay, great. So I'm going to wrap a little bit of this up here. As a reminder, you'll receive a recording of this webinar via email. Feel free to follow up with us should you have any additional question. As a heads up, next month, Galen will be presenting at Greenlight Guru's True Quality Virtual Summit. The registration link should be dropped in the chat window here. I think it just was, yep. And Galen's CTO, Abbas, will be presenting on planning your cloud connectivity strategy to reduce cybersecurity and privacy risk. So we'll hope you'll join us. And Galen will also be exhibiting at the Medtech conference in Minneapolis. So if you'll be there, feel free to reach out. They'd love to get together with you. In terms of getting a hold of our 3 panelists here, if you have a reason to get a hold of myself, feel free. I can always connect you as well. It's just info@projectmedtech.com. But I know Isabella is very active on LinkedIn, so I'm sure that's a great path to reach out to her as well. Jason, I'm guessing same for you.
LinkedIn is great. I'm on there, yes.
Okay, Jack?
Yep, and or just go through the NAMSA website, and you'll find us.
Yeah, perfect.
I'm also going to be at the Medtech conference, and I'll also be a part of that summit. And I also have a webinar on Thursday with Greenlight. So if you want to see me a whole lot in the next month, that's how you can make that happen.
Awesome. And just so everyone's aware too, all 3 of these folks will be on my podcast at some time or another. So you'd be sure to check that out. But we really appreciate all 3 of your time. I thought it was really great. It's always fun to sit down and talk about why it's important to think about all these things early and often as a startup company. And I think just evident by the discussion here today, you can see that's important. So appreciate it very much. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your day.